the majority of Australians, when you kind of ask them like what they think of when they think of the Republic of the Korea, it's like it's K-pop, it's K-drama, it's Blackpink, it's Parasite, it's Gangnam Style, it's kimchi. Or they think of North Korea when it comes to foreign policy or strategic policy. They don't necessarily think of South Korea as the more dynamic, the more kind of impactful of the two Koreas in terms of the regional strategic balance.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news.
Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at the United States Study Center. Thank you for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. In December 2024, South Korean President Yoon declared martial law and had military troops surround the National Assembly before reversing that decision following an immediate backlash and widespread protests. Now we've just learned that South Korea's Constitutional Court announced its verdict to uphold the impeachment of President Yoon, ending 18 weeks of political uncertainty in Seoul. With President Yoon removed from office, South Korea is gearing up for a snap election on the 3rd of June. USSC sent a delegation to South Korea following a 1.5-track dialogue we hosted with the Embassy of the Republic of Korea the week prior to the martial law declaration. The dialogue was on the topic of Australia-ROK defense cooperation, and then our delegation was there when the political crisis unfolded. So in this USSC briefing room, we're going to discuss the ramifications of the impeachment verdict, what, if anything, this might mean for the future of Korea's engagement in the region with Australia, as well as with the United States. I'm joined by my USSC colleagues, Tom Corwin and Kester Abbott. Tom played a big hand in orchestrating the Track 1.5 workshop in Canberra, and Kester was on the subsequent delegation in Korea when martial law was declared. The two of them recently published the outcomes report from the Track 1.5 dialogue, along with colleague Esther Soulard, which captured the key questions and discussion points that are currently animating the Australia-Korea security relationship. So Tom and Kester, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Mari.
Thank you.
And at the end of the show, we'll get your by the numbers stat. You good to go on that?
Yeah.
Great.
Excellent. All right. So to start things off, what happens between now and this upcoming snap election? If you could tell us a bit about where Korean domestic politics are at right now, and where we'll be at, what are the most significant issues in this presidential race that our listeners should keep an eye on?
Well, thanks, Mari. As you mentioned, the Constitutional Court's decision to uphold the impeachment verdict on President Yoon has put an end to some 4 months of uncertainty in the relationship. I think in the lead up to the announcement, there was some concern about the trajectory this was heading in. As you know, acting president, the Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, he only escaped that once the Constitutional Court voted it down by 7-1. Yoon himself was also released from custody for his criminal trial over the martial law, which is still ongoing. And indeed, it's interesting because out of that Constitutional Court, which has 8 members, 6 of them are conservative appointed individuals, or 2 of which come from the Moon Jae-in progressive administration. Yet, the fact that the announcement was actually delayed and we had a unanimous decision from the Constitutional Court on the verdict, I think that's sort of ended this period in Seoul's political turmoil. And indeed, President Yoon, it appears he hasn't contested the verdict. And acting President Han, he's called for national unity, and he's actually apologized for the situation over the last 4 months. So what this means, as you said, if we're going to have a snap election, it has to be done within 60 days. That's going to be on the 3rd of June. And we're already seeing a host of contenders sort of throwing their hat into the ring. While there are an array of political parties in Korea, it's going to be determined by 2 parties. That's the ruling 국민의힘, or People Power Party, the PPP, and the main opposition group, the 더불어민주당, which is the Democratic Party of Korea, or DPK. And so on the DPK front, it's most likely it's going to be Lee Jae-myung, the leader of this opposition group. He ran in 2022 and narrowly was beaten by President Yoon by only 0.7%. This was the closest presidential election in Korean history. Recently, he was also acquitted for convictions of election fraud. So this means he can run again. And indeed, the latest poll suggests he's in the lead. Gallup showing 34%, whilst another one saying that if it's amongst the three top candidates, it'll be 57%. On the other aisle, the PPP candidates, we've seen lawmaker Ahn Cheol-soo, former Labour Minister Kim Moon-soo, who's left his post actually recently to begin campaigning. However, they're still in the single digits at the moment. There's also been reports that in a few days, Seoul's mayor, On Soo-hoon, he's going to announce his bid for the presidency, and sort of the Seoul mayor is sort of considered the launching pad for the presidency. But the trouble is that compared to the DPK, or the sort of position Lee Jae-myung is in, conservatives, they're going to have to find a candidate they can sort of unite around. There isn't someone at the moment that appears to be doing that, and we're only a few months away. During the impeachment scandal, the PPP was unable to do this because if they had considered a future without Yoon, that would have been a huge sign of a lack of confidence in Yoon. But because of that now, there's an association with some of its members to that Yoon legacy. So I think that's going to be a particular issue for the Korean public, particularly that third who identify in the middle as neither conservative or progressive, sort of getting that base, that's going to be an issue. When you said about the most significant issues going forward, that's a really great question. And I think it comes down to two main areas. The first one is going to be that issue of uniting the country, bringing a candidate who can appear as a uniting figure. That's going to be a huge issue, I think, for both political candidates. When we look at Lee Jae-myung, he might be polling ahead compared to his candidates, but he's also been known to sort of not tolerate dissenting voices within his own party. He has also dealing with a lot of political and legal baggage, which may taint his reputation going forward. And indeed, it was in 2022 that President Yoon pointed to this and said, do you want to deal with a candidate or a president, who sort of wants it his way or no way? So I think, certainly while the impeachment verdict has brought an end to this previous 4 months, the unrest doesn't, or the political uncertainty doesn't rest there. We're entering a career that's highly politically polarized. And just as a point of comparison, sort of 72% of conservatives found that they would actually support President Yoon's reinstatement. And when we compare that to the previous impeachment of President Park Geun-hye in 2017, it was only 20% of conservatives who wanted her reinstatement. So it's a very volatile environment both candidates are going to be moving into. And also, about the uniting figure, the DPK has also been criticized for its handling of the constitutional crisis, for its own political gains, some people have said. So actually in January, we saw the PPP overtake the DPK in its approval rating. So this is a still uncertain time.
That's fascinating. And it's reminding me of last year in the U.S. presidential election when we had a last-minute change of who was leading the Democratic ticket, and when President Biden dropped out of the race. But that was still 3.5 months before the election, nearly double what we're looking at here for this Korean election. So it seems that things are moving at pace. And even the Australian election, we're in the middle of that campaign right now, and even that is only 6 weeks. So these things move very, very quickly. But if we just go back in time to when we had that initial declaration of martial law, when you were there in December, what was your perception of the crisis? And how does what we heard about it in media match what your experience was on the ground? Is it similar? And I guess, how did it feel, especially going just from having this dialogue and then we're talking about Australia, Korea cooperation, and then this massive upheaval while you were in the country?
Yeah, well, we can say our dialogues was very timely. Wasn't planned, but in coming from Canberra and then went straight to Seoul to hold this other dialogue with Japanese, Korean, and US counterparts. It was quite a shock on the evening when we were talking about sort of resilience and a united front amongst us. Initially, I was in my hotel room and got the news, and I thought, this can't be real. This is Korea. And I think a lot of foreigners from the outside, with the rise of K-pop or K-drama, they sort of see Korea as this sort of shining beacon of culture and indeed democracy. I think just to look at the US reaction to the martial law announcement, I think they were also in shock, and there was quite a lot of silence from the embassy and officials there. And I think not just for the United States, but for the broader international community, Korea has sort of been that sort of exemplar of democracy and a sort of capitalist economy, from the 1980s onwards. And I think Korea had been really central in the Biden administration's, push for democracies versus autocracies. Indeed, Korea hosted the third iteration of the Summit for Democracy. So this was a real setback, I think. But on the day, like the next day, Koreans were going to their work. So it was still very orderly. And I think actually momentum started to pick up from there. And we started to have the protest, the National Assembly in central Seoul in Gwanghwamun. So I think it's from there that we've really seen this political polarization sort of like grow over the few months. And indeed, on the day that the impeachment announcement was going to come out by the Constitutional Court, the Seoul city authorities had rallied 14,000 police troops in case of disorder. So that's the sort of development. It took time to build up, but it was certainly volatile.
And I'd like to think about the dialogue that we had just before the Korea trip and then everything unfolded. And this was a defense and security dialogue between Korean and Australian officials. It's the first one in quite some time. So Tom, I wonder if you could walk us through some of the key policy drivers that prompted USSC and the Republic of Korea Embassy to hold this dialogue in the first place.
Thanks, Mara. Yeah, it was the first real substantial defense and security dialogue, in a bilateral sense at least, between Australian and Korean officials and policy experts in a long time. I think there's a couple of drivers here. They're not all things that you can necessarily tie to the current strategic environment or current policy imperatives. They actually kind of go to the heart of what the Australia-ROK relationship is supposed to be about. And it kind of begs the question, like, why focus on Australia-South Korea ties at all? Like, why is it important, period, not just right now? I mean, I could list off all the usual reasons that policymakers and analysts usually give you when they're asked why is Australia-ROK relations important, why are the two countries working together. The reasons you normally hear are, we're both liberal democracies. That is still the case. I'll just note, even despite what's happened in South Korea, I think the strength of the civil society pro-democracy movements in Korea like proved itself to be incredibly robust. And if you know anything about Korean history, you know how hard they fought for that during periods of dictatorship. Anyway, I digress. We're both market economies. We're both liberal market economies. That is also very true. We're both US allies. Yes, that is also very true. We're both treaty allies. We're like-minded in terms of our values and our regional strategies and so forth. Those are usually the reasons you get when you ask policymakers and experts why the two countries are working together. But it's my perspective, and I think it's the perspective of some in Korea increasingly, actually, including those who we kind of had at the workshop out of Seoul, that it's actually really important to go back to basics and revisit those assumptions, or kind of revisit what actually underlies those statements. Like the things I just listed off, they're all kind of true statements of fact about how our countries are, but they don't really necessarily tell us a lot about why our countries want to work together in the new regional strategic environment in kind of which our relationship is starting to take on a new level of significance. So basically the point of the dialogue, I think from the center's perspective at least, was to really interrogate those basic questions, like interrogate where our country's strategic interests in this new geopolitical context are intersecting, and kind of candidly ask the question, where do they and where do they not align? There are a couple of, to go to the question of what are the key policy drivers here, I mean, there's a couple, like the region is changing in kind of really dynamic and unforeseen ways. That's due to structural power shifts in terms of which countries hold the most kind of military, economic, demographic, industrial power, what have you. It's also due to kind of domestic political developments, not only in South Korea, but there's also an election coming up here in Australia. We've just had a very consequential election in the United States. A lot of other major countries in the region have also had recent elections or will be having elections soon. I think it's also the case, and it's not something that I think is often really reflected on in much detail, but South Korea is kind of in a position now where it has more national power than it ever has historically. And Australia is kind of also in this really interesting period where we're seeking to exercise our agency in the region and to shape regional strategic dynamics in new and creative ways that I don't think are fully understood necessarily by the wider region. I think that's a conversation that's maturing gradually in Australia, but it's often hard to communicate that to the region, particularly in Southeast Asia, but also partners in Northeast Asia who we would think, for the reasons I listed before, would understand us because of our similarities. And then finally, maybe just to drill down on the assumptions point, I think the Australian policy community, from my experience, having been working the Australia-ROK relationship for maybe 7 or 8 years now, is that we often make assumptions about what South Korea will or should do in terms of foreign policy or in terms of strategic policy on those above assumptions rather than kind of what's happening in Korean politics or what is kind of actually being implemented in practical terms in terms of what Korea is actually doing in terms of a strategy, not just what it says it will do, not just what we kind of think it will do based on its liberal, democratic, economic alignment characteristics. The majority of Australians, when you kind of ask them like what they think of when they think of the Republic of the Korea, it's like it's K-pop, it's K-drama, it's Blackpink, it's Parasite, it's Gangnam Style, it's kimchi. Or they think of North Korea when it comes to foreign policy or strategic policy. They don't necessarily think of South Korea as the more dynamic, the more kind of impactful of the two Koreas in terms of the regional strategic balance. And then on the other side, I think it's fair to say that a lot of Koreans, everyday Koreans, when you ask them what they think of Australia, its beaches, its strange wildlife, it's a nice place to study. On foreign policy, in the past, we've often been seen to kind of be simply parroting US interests or strategic talking points, which, as we know from a lot of the work at the centre, is really a massive oversimplification of what Australia is actually trying to do in terms of foreign policy and strategy in the region. So really the dialogue is kind of was really about kind of trying to drill down on those assumptions to test them, to kind of get a sense check of whether they're still the correct basis from which we should be analyzing the relationship. And if not, what does that mean for the aperture of our collaboration? What does that mean for where the opportunities and the barriers are, and so forth?
So you've done a great job of kind of setting up the context in which this dialogue happened and a lot of factors at play there. Now, can you take us almost like inside the room? If we had a seat at the table for this dialogue, what were the sorts of emerging themes and discussions and takeaways that came out of this discussion you had?
Yeah, sure. So there is an outcomes report that's publicly available on the USSC website, which I think lists 9 or 10 of the key outcomes from across the day-long dialogue that we thought were worthy of further discussion, not just kind of noting in a public sense, but to kind of give you a broader, maybe, I don't know, a general sense or like my top picks for the outcomes from that dialogue. Like any good 1.5 track engagement, there were more questions than answers. That also means that we're hoping to host a follow-up dialogue later this year. I think we'll try to drill down on some of the more specific policy outcomes from the discussions that we had. The first dialogue was really intended as a bit of a level-setting conversation to kind of encourage our communities to revisit assumptions about the basis on which our two countries are collaborating. In terms of some of the main topics for discussion that came out, bear in mind that this dialogue was taking place just after President Trump had been reelected for his second term. So there was a lot of kind of anxiety and opinion in the room about what this meant for the region, what this meant for our respective countries, and potentially what this meant for our relationship together. I think it became quite clear over the course of the dialogue that while on the surface our two countries are facing broadly similar questions about what the return of Donald Trump means for our two countries in terms of what impacts this could have on our economies, what impacts this could have on the region, we're also facing quite different questions when it comes to defense and security issues, particularly when it comes to alliance commitments, the terms of those alliance commitments, questions of burden sharing, which, as we know, President Trump is particularly fond of bashing allies on. And it's probably worth pointing out that South Korea was a particular target for that during the first Trump administration. So I would not be surprised at all if we kind of saw a return to that. Also noting, of course, that some key Pentagon appointees now, they were nominees at the time, but in their confirmation hearings, they were suggesting that Australia and other countries like Japan were not spending nearly enough on defense. Funnily enough, actually, they pointed to South Korea as an example of what other countries should be doing in terms of increasing their own national defense and their own kind of defense industrial and technology sophistication. But I still think you can expect to see some pressure on Korea there. Another kind of macro finding is I think we still really need to settle on a clear purpose and a clear role for defense collaboration in our relationship. In a bilateral sense, it's often been based around economics and people-to-people ties. Those two things are still really, really important. we've now introduced this new kind of weighty defense and security concept at the official and at the kind of the policy analyst level, but we really need to think through in a serious way, okay, why are we doing this? Why are we investing the time and the resources in trying to build up our relationship to be some kind of value add to the regional security environment when there are plenty of other options for our two countries to work with? There's Japan, there's the United States, there are key countries in Southeast Asia. The Europeans want to play ball in Asia to some extent too. So why should we, as our two countries, work together? Like, what are the tangible and the intangible benefits of our bilateral collaboration or our collaboration with other third parties that we can't necessarily get from others? And then maybe the last thing I'll say before I hand over to Kester to share his thoughts was kind of on the defense and security bit in particular. The defense industry piece of the bilateral relationship has probably received the most attention in terms of what's happening in the bilateral defense space. There have been some wins there. This has been a long-term kind of project, at least for the last 10 or 15 years. Korean companies have won some pretty high-profile Australian defense contracts for land systems, but there have also been some pretty notable setbacks recently too. Like, I'll get to this in my figure of the week, but there have been some pretty major cuts to the programs that Korean companies had already won or were about to win. Korean companies also failed to progress in the bid for Australia's Future Frigates program, for example, when they expected that they would be amongst the finalists. That's one example of kind of a headwind, I think, that the relationship will need to deal with as we kind of move forward, especially seeing as it's ground zero for defense security collaboration in the bilateral relationship at the moment.
And how about you, Kester? What are your thoughts and takeaways from it?
Yeah, no, I think perhaps more of a question that arose out of this discussion was sort of the ensuring that the relationship between Korea and Australia is robust enough where we can sort of respond or coordinate over emerging sort of threats in the regional security environment. And one that was specifically raised in particular was the possibility of the DPRK playing a more forthright approach to regional and global security issues. And this was mainly coming off the back of the DPRK's actions with Russia and the Ukraine. So already in 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, North Korea provided immense diplomatic support. It furthered this by providing munitions. Eventually in June 2024, President Putin and Kim Jong-un signed a comprehensive strategic partnership, and this was really significant. I mean, Article 4 of that treaty sounds very much reminiscent of a sort of formal alliance, and indeed, we saw after that North Korea providing troops to the battlefield. And this is the first time since the Korean War that North Korea has engaged in combat, and it's being allowed the opportunity to test weapon systems, including K-23, a K-24 short-range ballistic missile. So this really shows that the long-term trends on the peninsula are worrying, because North Korea is now having actual combat experience where it can test these systems. But in terms of whether this views as a change in Pyongyang, if it believes it has more agency in the sort of regional security environment, that's still up to debate. But I think it's important that Australia and Korea and others like Japan and the United States prepare themselves for that possibility. So I think hopefully at the end of this year, when we host hopefully another Track 1.5 discussion, we can drill deeper into that discussion.
And so if we kind of marry up these themes from the discussion with then the political reality that unfolded so shortly after, what, if anything, do you think the impeachment verdict will mean in the near-term future for South Korea's foreign policy priorities and then their engagement with regional partners, particularly Australia and the United States?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, when it comes to the US-ROK relationship, it's going to be very difficult for either candidate, this is specifically for the progressive side, to sort of oppose the US-ROK relationship because it has such bipartisan support and it has so much public support for the relationship. Regardless of what Koreans think of Trump, that support is up to the 80% mark, and it's been that way consistently. It is something that's going to have to be dealt with, though, and I think Koreans have had a trouble during this impeachment crisis because they believe they haven't had the executive leadership to sort of engage with Trump on these issues. There's discussion that once the leader of Korea is elected, they're going to go to Washington, they're going to give out a platter, if you will, and say, oh, can we provide you that will kind of sweeten a deal, whether it's energy, critical minerals or technology or shipbuilding. That is something that's being discussed, I think, in Seoul. The issue is that doesn't confirm that they're going to get any advantages from that. If we just look at Japan's example, when Prime Minister Shiba, when he visited Washington and he announced this $1 trillion investment in the United States, he still got these tariffs of 24%. So whilst, the existence of executive leadership would be welcome, there's still going to be challenges in the ROK relationship. And as Tom was mentioning earlier, burden sharing is going to be a huge part of that. For example, in his first term in 2017, Trump, he was visiting the newly expanded and renovated Camp Humphreys, which is a US garrison base. It's just 45 miles south of Seoul. And when he was seeing this base, which the ROK contributed a substantial amount of money towards, he perceived it as evidence that the ROK should actually pay more for the military presence rather than as an indication of the strength of the alliance. So I think that's going to go forward. And since the 1990s, at least, Trump has consistently identified South Korea and Germany for areas where the US should actually pull back its troops. He doesn't think it's a good deal. And so I think, once the new leader comes in, there's going to have to be changes or some sort of reform within the relationship, but that's not going to change. And I think also Lee Jae-myung, he previously has stated some things about efforts like, for example, US ROK, Japan trilateralism, but now he seems to be right-clicking. He seems to be more going to the center, and he's come out of support of that and allegedly spoken with Japanese counterparts to say that is still a central issue. So I think we are going to see more continuity, but it's whether those tariffs, does that impact, and how does that impact Koreans' view of investment in the US as a partner as well in the trade area, because it's invested $116 billion over the last 3 years alone. Those are going to be some difficult questions that the new leader in Korea is going to have to address.
And I guess just to wrap it up, I would love to know if there's anything from your experience of going through the dialogue and then, being boots on the ground in Korea while this unfolded, and then as we're watching and thinking about this implementation moving forward, what do you think people should know about what's happening in South Korea or the Korea-Australia relationship, international relations? What should they know that they might not be hearing about in the news?
Sure. So maybe just to pick up on the potential near-term futures for South Korean foreign policy out of the upcoming election. It's kind of difficult to predict where Seoul is going to go in terms of its regional engagement. So on the one hand, President Yoon and his administration were widely lauded, not only in the United States, but also amongst the Australian policy community, for formally adopting the Indo-Pacific concept as their kind of regional strategic framing mechanism, for seeking to be a more active player both on the regional and the global stage. It was kind of reflected in President Yoon's concept of Korea being a global pivotal state. And that kind of included not just showing up at diplomatic meetings, but actually getting involved, rolling up Korean sleeves and getting involved in kind of the region's strategic, economic, and geopolitical challenges more broadly. I think we'll probably see some more analysis of this come out in the coming weeks, but I think there's a general sense amongst the commentariat so far that maybe the Yoon administration didn't quite walk the talk. I think that would be unfair based on my engagements with Korean kind of diplomats and experts over the last couple of years to suggest that that was for a lack of trying. I did really get a sense from this administration that they were genuinely interested and serious about playing a bigger role in the region. It was just kind of a matter of finding where Korea fit best, where it could conceivably contribute resources, not just this year, not just next year, but kind of over a longer term horizon to be a more meaningful regional strategic player. So there's that recent piece of it. But to go to kind of what Kester just mentioned before about some of the views that the progressive candidate for President Lee Jae-myung has kind of expressed previously about where he thinks South Korea's priorities should be, I think it's safe to say they are not necessarily out in the wider region. They are much more narrowly focused on the Korean Peninsula, questions of North Korea, questions of US policy towards North Korea, and what have you. And that's kind of true to the longer form kind of foreign policy vision or tradition of progressives in Korea, is to have that much narrower focus on the Korean Peninsula instead of kind of focusing on the wider region. I mean, Moon Jae-in, who was President Yoon's predecessor, I think it would be unfair to overlook the fact that his administration was the first to really put out something that looked like an Indo-Pacific strategy, even if it wasn't called an Indo-Pacific strategy. It was called the New Southern Policy. But the actions his administration pursued were very much focused on North Korea, very much focused on the Korean Peninsula. So I guess the too long didn't read of what I've just said is that there's kind of a big question mark now over the future of Korea's wider regional engagement. And kind of sitting here in Australia, that's important because in this kind of increasingly uncertain strategic environment, particularly with what's happening in the United States, but also kind of these other regional political developments in capitals of countries with whom we have strong ties and who we have kind of a strong interest in them playing a bigger role in the region. It's going to be important for Australia, I think, to get an early sense of where the next administration in Korea wants to go on regional strategy, and to kind of look at that in an honest light and not necessarily revert to the assumptions which, as I mentioned before, we've kind of made about what Korea would or should or will do in the region based on what it says, and we should actually look at what it's doing.
Just to pick up on Tom was saying, I think if there is any indication of a regional strategy coming out of Korea, of course, we've seen issues from north of the 38th parallel always bring Korea back and sort of dampen those ambitions. If we do think that the next administration is a progressive government, when sort of looking to Lee's former track record, when he was on the campaign trail in 2020 for the 2022 election, he did say in 2021 that he wanted to include the New Southern Policy as a central framework of his foreign policy. And indeed, Lee, like Yoon, is a political outsider. He doesn't have foreign policy experience, but the one area he does really have experience in that realm is with Southeast Asia. And in his former position as governor of the Gyeonggi province, he directly contributed to Moon Jae-in's NSP by pioneering that province's economic entry into ASEAN markets in 2019, and he made subsequent visits to Thailand and Myanmar. So I think also on that trail, the former ambassador to ASEAN, Lim Song-nam, he also stepped down from his position to join Lee. So it seems like we'll see if a regional strategy comes out of this, but I think Southeast Asia would be at the top of the minds if it was.
Very fascinating. And now I'd love to get your by-the-numbers stats. What do you have for us today? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first.
Okay.
So true to my record on this program, I have two numbers. They're
Good
both
value for money for us.
They're both percentages. The first is 50%.
Okay.
The second is 71%.
All right. What can you tell us about these percentages?
So the 50% refers to the reduction that Australia decided to make in its plans to procure self-propelled howitzers, so basically like army field guns. That was a product of the Defence Strategic Review in 2023, which kind of recommended a shift away in Australian military force planning from a balanced force where you kind of more or less have equitable investment across the services to something that favoured air and maritime capabilities a lot more than land capabilities. So as a result of that, we saw a 50% reduction in the number of howitzers that Australia was supposed to procure. Those howitzers were supposed to be built by a Korean company, Hanwha Defence Australia. The 71% reduction refers to cuts to what Australia originally projected to be the procurement of 450 infantry fighting vehicles, down to 129. That reduction was made before the contract was awarded, unlike the howitzer award. But the IFV contract was also ultimately given to the very same Korean company that built the howitzers. I share these stats because I think they're indicative of one of the hurdles that I think Australia and Korea are going to have to get over on defense industrial collaboration if this relationship is going to bear fruit for both countries. So on the one hand, part of the reason that Korea was able to secure these contracts in the first place was because the capabilities they were offering are world-class and have proven to be. And in some ways, they're kind of a product of Korea's constant need to be militarily ready in case of a conflict with North Korea, and the focus on the army and on land systems that comes as a product of that. On the other hand, Australia may have been looking for those kind of systems in the past, but now with the changes in the regional strategic environment and therefore what the Australian government believes that it needs in order to meet the military requirements of that changed strategic environment, there's less of a call now in Australia for the exact kind of land capabilities and land systems that Korean companies are world-class in producing and have been looking to offer to Australia. So the primary challenge there from a Korean perspective is to find capabilities or find kind of attractive propositions for Australia that are in the naval and the air domains when it comes to defense industrial production that can conceivably compete with the sources of where Australia normally gets its other systems in those domains. And that's usually the United States or Europe. And that's a pretty big ask for Korean defense industry. It's not that they don't have really good capabilities to offer. It's just that they're coming up against countries with defense kind of industrial ecosystems that are much more well-versed in international salesmanship, much more versed in international defense industrial integration. There's a big hurdle to overcome there. And then from the Australian perspective, it's a little less tangible, which is a little less satisfying, but it's almost a bit of a mindset issue. It's about recognizing it's about recognizing two things. One, that the best military systems in the world will not always come from the United States or from the West. There are increasingly valuable propositions to be found in non-traditional suppliers of defense hardware, including South Korea. And I guess the second part there kind of goes to, this assumption that what America has kind of is not only the best, but is essential for the sake of our interoperability. One of the reasons that the Korean frigate wasn't selected as one of the finalists in the ongoing tender process was kind of a concern about how interoperable it would be with the systems that Australia already had. Now, that may be true for the Korean frigate system, but it's not universally true necessarily about what Korea has to offer. So I think kind of getting over the interoperability block and the Western block from an Australian perspective in terms of how we're thinking about the value of working together with a non-traditional defense player like Korea is going to be really essential if the bilateral defense industry relationship is actually going to kind of produce anything that is meaningful and sustainable in the long term for both countries.
Yeah, that's great. And how about you, Kester? What number do you have for us today?
My number is 38%.
Okay.
And 38% was the most recent Gallup poll that found that 38% of Koreans don't have a preference for the next presidential candidate. That is like a huge number of people in South Korea that, despite everything with the impeachment crisis, still don't mind if it's a PPP or a DPK leader. And I think from our perspective here in Australia, I think these next few months are going to be really critical, ensuring that the leading political candidates, and indeed the months after, once that candidate has been elected, that Australia really makes the case that its strategic partnership is in the interest of Korea, and don't look at it through a sort of partisan lens, in the sense that, yes, there was a huge amount of strategic and defense alignment under the Yoon administration, but there's also opportunities, I think, which can be accomplished under any administration, much as we saw in 2021 with the Moon Jae-in period establishing a CSP with Australia. So critical months ahead, but it's still up for debate.
Oh, fascinating. Very interesting stats. Thank you. So if anyone listening to this podcast wants to get more on this topic, please make sure to go to the USSC website at ussc.edu.au and download or view a copy of Australia, Republic of Korea Dialogue on Security Cooperation Outcomes Report. And it's written by Tom, Kester, and Esther on our staff. So as we wrap up, I'd love to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is co-host of the Asia Chessboard podcast, and I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our Election Watch series from last year, as well as recordings from our Sydney International Strategy Forum. So you can find these on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Tom and Kester, thank you so much for joining me today.